So as I understand it, our next paper is by distance, yeah? So I'm waiting for it to come up on my screen here. I don't think I have to do anything. Our next paper is by Giselle González García. She's a third-year Ph.D. student at Concordia University in Montreal in Canada, School of Irish Studies, and her research looks at the history of coffee plantations and Irish migration in Cuba. And she's recently published on coffee plantations and Irish migration to Santiago de Cuba, a historical case study of radical environmental transformation. And her paper title, thank God, right behind me, is on Archaeological Remains of Coffee Plantations, a History of Pre-Famine Irish Migration to Cuba. So, Giselle, I presume you can hear me. I don't think I'll be able to tell you when you've got your 5-minute kind of bit, so I'll ask you to keep a very tight idea on your own timing, okay?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'm coming to you from Montreal. I would have loved to be there, but unfortunately I couldn't. But thank you for inviting me and for this opportunity. So I'm going to take you across the Atlantic and to Cuba's eastern region to talk about coffee. This early morning here, so yeah. In February 2020, I visited Santiago as a sort of research trip, searching for archival sources and material remains of an Irish historical presence in that city. Once there, I noticed that there was a coffee shop located in a very centric position at Plaza de Martes, one of the city's main square, with the name of a coffee plantation that I was researching. This was La Gran Sofia Cafe, and it was like named after La Gran Sofia plantation, which I knew at the time had been once owned by Dublin native James Jenkinson Wright. I found out later that La Gran Sofia, from La Gran Sofia, Wright often wrote letters to his aunts and cousins who lived in Dublin, where he discussed his conversion to Catholicism. He was from a Quaker family, and his experiences as a coffee planter and slave owner in Santiago, which at the time, this completely blew my mind. But what was most striking to me at the time of my 2020 visit to this cafe, was that it was decorated with the archaeological remains of his namesake. And what they were trying to do with this pictures in the walls and the decoration was to inscribe this cafe as part of the French cultural legacy of the city. It turns out this was one of many new establishments in Santiago that were opened in 2015 to mark the 500th anniversary of the city, of the foundation of the city. But arguably, this cafe commemorates La Gran Sofia as an important part of the coffee legacy of the region, but not James Wright, his Irish owner. La Gran Sofia is only one of 171 archaeological remains of coffee plantations identified in the mountains of La Sierra Maestra, in that little red circle here, in Cuba's eastern region. Thus far, I have found that at least 28 of those were actually linked to Irish immigrants that arrived in Cuba in 2 different waves. For the purpose of this presentation, I separate these migrations into 2 groups to be able to tell you specific characteristics about them. I will try to provide here some answers to the following questions. How did Irish immigrants arrive and settle in early Santiago de Cuba? Early 19th century, Santiago de Cuba. What did they take an interest in coffee planting specifically? Why are these archaeological remains relevant today, and why they should be studied at all? What do they tell us about Irish immigration? I want to give you a quick disclaimer. My studies are in history, not in archaeology, so I will mostly talk about migration in this paper, but I will also show you a little bit of the plantations and the information that I have been able to gather about them. Now I will give you a brief historical context of this migration. So for hundreds of pre-famine Irish immigrants, Cuba was an island of opportunities, and this often lay in the burgeoning sugar and coffee industries that dominated the island's economy during the first half of the 19th century. In 1807, Santiago de Cuba was a very small but rapidly growing city that had a local elite that had hoped to compete with Havana in the West. In 1791, due to its geographical proximity with the French colony of Saint-Domingue, Santiago de Cuba became the ideal recipient for multiple waves of thousands of refugees that fled from turmoil caused by revolution there. And this was this largely French influx that local historians have credited for the inception of a coffee industry that dominated world markets in the subsequent decades. Irish immigrants' participation in these processes have been completely overshadowed by much higher numbers of French people and other groups. However, although the numbers of Irish immigrants were small, and I estimate that they were less than 1% of the population, they still made a significant impact in the area by becoming part of the city's planter and merchant elite, and by expanding the international reach of the local economy to the export of staple goods. They also exerted a considerable influence in local institutions and local politics. For example, by the 1830s, two of the biggest coffee plantations, La Gran Sofia in Kentucky, were owned by Irish immigrant James J. Wright, a Quaker turned Catholic who was at times British consul, coffee planter, slave trader, slave owner, merchant, and also commercial agent for different enterprises based in Cuba, the United States, and Britain. But he was not the only one. So now I will talk about the migratory groups that I have identified, and I will describe them generally. An Irish presence in Santiago de Cuba dates back to 1665. The first group that settled in the area developed a sense of symbolic Irish identity expressed through their naming practices. They kept recycling the same names generation after generation that alluded to their specific regional origins in Ireland. If anybody wants an example of this, I can talk about it in the Q&A. They had a hand in creating a local elite into which groups of the immigrants of the second group inserted themselves in the early decades of the 19th century. But members of this first group started to arrive in the late 17th century and continued to do so until the late 18th century. And they had ties to the famous Irish wild geese families that have fled to continental Europe after 1607. And after the Cromwellian conquest of Ireland in 1649, and after the Treaty of Limerick in 1691. And throughout the 18th century, these Irish wild geese numbers were replenished with a very intricate policy of recruitment. In Spain and in Spanish America, many of these families became staunch supporters of colonial domination and the maintenance of a slavery regime. Members of this group constructed an Irish identity that was intrinsically linked to Roman Catholicism and was based on a special relationship with the Spanish monarchy. They constructed a special status that allowed members of this group to insert themselves into the local elite cohorts and to effect social climbing strategies. Cuban records show that they were mostly military men who used marriage effectively to access wealth and land ownership. They also claim nobility, which was a coveted status sought by a Cuban Creole planter class that was consolidating its sphere of influence on the island and was expanding its economic power. As an example of families in this group, I can mention the Duani family, originally from County Sligo, and the Kindelan family, who were from County Meath and had left Ireland after the Cromwellian invasion, the Nocton family, who came from Athlone and the border areas between counties Roscommon and Westmeath, and the McGrahons, who were from Galway. There are other examples of families that I have not yet located in Ireland, but they had an Irish origin, such as the Garvey and the Cray families. By contrast, the second group of Irish immigrants to Santiago was composed by a wider cohort of transnational and trans-imperial adventurers. Their arrival in Santiago in Cuba coincided with the consolidation of the social climbing strategies of the wild geese, Santiago Irish immigrants during the administration of first-generation Irish Sebastian Kindelan O'Regan, who was political and military governor of the province during the key years for the development of coffee industry from 1799 until 1810. Kindelan not only enabled coffee planters' development with a tax exemption policy, but he also became a planter and slave owner himself, alongside his wife, who was also third-generation Irish, and her name was Ana Manuela Mozo de la Torre Garvey. So the members of the second group began to arrive in the first years of the 1800s, and they had no links to Spain, no special relationship with the Spanish crown, and initially no stake in Roman Catholicism. This marked a shift in the route that was bringing Irish immigrants into Cuba, from Spain and continental Europe to North America, and in particularly to the Atlantic cities of the United States. This group's members suffered important transformation in their identities. They reinvented themselves ideologically and politically by drifting further away from republicanism and becoming conservative endorsers of slavery and Spanish colonial domination. Religiously, they embraced Spanish Catholicism by effecting strategic conversions, but they were not fully embraced as such and were often subjected to the suspicion by Spanish colonial authorities and the local population. Moreover, although their political loyalties lay with Spain in the Spanish American Empire, in practice, many of these Irish immigrants' economic interests were actually vested in the establishment of an informal commercial relationship that prioritized the interests of the more attractive and geographically closer United States. So they were very North American focused, which was a very different attitude than the Irish wild geese. The migratory origins also can be traced to Baltimore and Philadelphia specifically, and several members of this group were actually Irish Quakers who turned into Catholics and then subscribed to a pro-slavery ideology and articulated a paternalistic discourse that was similar to the one often found in the Old South of the United States to justify slavery. In Santiago de Cuba, these Irish Quakers followed specific strategies for integration. These were, as I have mentioned, religious conversion, naturalization of Spanish subjects, creation of an intricate business network, engagement in the illicit African slave trade, and the purchase of rural and urban properties in Santiago. Now, some case studies of Irishmen that fit this characterization were Dubliner James Jenkinson Wright, as I have mentioned earlier, whose family had settled in Ballinclay in County Wexford, Armagh native Richard Maxwell Bell, brothers William and Samuel Wanton, originally from Valentra, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that well, in County Donegal, Simon and Cornelius O'Callaghan, and Philip Boylan, who was from County Cavan. Of this group, only Bell and O'Callaghan established family units in Santiago. The others acted more as individual and kept very close kinship ties with the United States and also with Ireland. Now, by 1827, these two groups, the Irish wild geese and the later migrants, the predominantly Quaker migrants, had merged into an elite cohort and had interconnected, created a web of close alliances and fierce competition. Moreover, these Irish immigrants in Santiago de Cuba interacted closely with other immigrants, French, English, Scottish, and the coffee plantations that they often purchased were developed alongside French settlers. Many of these plantations then retained their original French names. For example, La Gran Sofia had originally been named Sophie. And this gives us a hint as to why they are inscribed as part of a French cultural legacy, then obscuring Irish migratory experiences. Now I will talk a little bit about coffee and coffee planting. So historians generally agree that coffee was introduced to Cuba around the year 1748. Nevertheless, it did not emerge as a significant plantation crop until the early decades of the 19th century. Two main geographical areas that became coffee hubs were one in the west and one in the east. This had to do with local climate conditions in those areas and with the natural elevation of the terrain, which is required for coffee. In Western Cuba, the area southwest from Havana was particularly settled for this purpose, creating a coffee belt around the towns of Guajay, in the Vuelta Abajo region, in La Sierra del Rosario, and in Matanzas. In the west, the land was significantly more expensive. But in contrast, in 1790, just a year before the Haitian Revolution, only 5 or 6 states existed in Eastern Cuba. So there was plenty of land available to be developed into coffee plantations. A decade later, the price of the land in the east was still significantly cheaper than in the west. But planters in Eastern Cuba were deficient in knowledge, lacked the workforce, or had limited access to the knowledge required for extensive investment in coffee. So this allowed refugees from Saint-Domingue to leverage their capital and know-how to ensure their permanence in Cuba as refugees. In a brief span of time from 1800 until 1807, they acquired vast expanses of land, trafficked thousands of enslaved Africans, and delineated the first coffee plantations in La Sierra Maestra in the east. However, in 1810, in the context of the invasion of Spain by Bonaparte's forces, French people were asked to leave Spanish domains. And this vacuum was the one that created an opportunity for the local Creole elite who have been displaced to reclaim some of that economic power, and also for the Irish and other migrants to invest in coffee planting. Although an Irish presence was widespread all over the island of Cuba, and they were involved in coffee planting in both regions mentioned earlier, in this paper, I would only refer, in this paper, I would only refer to the plantations located in Eastern Cuba, because today these plantations are recognized as UNESCO's World Heritage. In total, I have identified 40 Irish coffee plantations all over the island, 12 located in the west and 28 in the east. From the 28 that I have found in the east, I was able to retrieve the precise geographical coordinates of only 17. Locating the majority of these states was actually a very difficult process because it involved cross-referencing archival manuscripts that are not in good condition with historical maps, and also with the documentation submitted by Cuban authorities to UNESCO in the 1990s. Furthermore, few of these states have been studied in detail, and their study is significantly hindered by several factors. One, after Hurricane Sandy in 2012, the access roads to where they are located in the mountains was significantly damaged. Two, historical manuscripts, as I have mentioned earlier, are inaccessible due to structural damage suffered by the building that houses the provincial archives. And three, the few manuscript records that have been digitized by local researchers show the extent of the deterioration of these valuable sources. Some of them have become completely unreadable. And yet, from these scarce sources, I was able to access, courtesies of Santiago's Center for the Study of Coffee Culture, I could discern a bit of a modus operandi of Irish planters in the city, which I will describe now. So many of the Irish-born immigrants that established themselves in Santiago de Cuba from 1810 to 1814 became involved in the slave trade, an enterprise that was legal until 1820. However, there is evidence that even after it became illegal, several Irishmen like James Wright and the Wanton brothers from Donegal continued to be involved to counter the significant losses that they have suffered due to crops failing in the years 1824 and 1825. When crops did not fail, other planters like Bell, for example, would not only sell their products of their own plantation, they would also buy the produce of other local planters and try to become their own kinds of like commercial agents. So many of these immigrants prefer to reside in their coffee haciendas, in their coffee plantations in the mountains, but they still purchase homes adjacent to the docks in the city, which was very convenient position and an indication of a change in the mentality where business took precedence over comfort. Now, residing near the docks broke also the custom followed by the established local elite that resided in more fashionable, near the more fashionable plazas or square. For example, the wild geese families like the Kindelans and Duanis had their urban residences at the Plaza de Dolores. Although immigrants like Wright and Bell were exporting coffee produced in their own plantations, they also became middlemen to other planters and the international market. They not only purchased coffee, they also bought Muscovado sugars, molasses, tobacco, rum, and other tropical products. Occasionally, Wright and his partners made purchases from planters not based in the east, but also based in the middle of the island in areas like Trinidad and Cienfuegos. And they also had a network of people in what they named at the time Cumberland Harbor, which is today referred as Guantanamo Bay. A valuable source that gives us details into the day-to-day operations of Irish coffee plantations is the Moses Taylor collection held at the New York Public Library. Planters like Wright, for example, could participate in the commission trade and enlist their own ships if they had contacts abroad that they could rely on. Once shipped, these products were received, redistributed, and sold by a network of agents and representatives. These agents' role were to procure insurance for the cargo, to enlist reliable captains to conduct the vessels, and to provide information on the demand for specific products and the oscillation of their prices. They were also responsible for sending gold and silver because there were no financial institutions established in Cuba at the time. So people like Wright and who had their own merchant houses had to be their own banks. The network of agents that Wright, for example, put together extended back to New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Boston, and the United Kingdom. And Wright had a very close association with the famous Barron's Brothers Bank in London that had managed the Louisiana Purchase. Even in the middle of the island, they also had their own agents, and they were constantly in communication, trying to outsmart their competitors. In this way, they were able to create a transnational business model that was outwards oriented. And like I had mentioned, this was relying very much on personal relationships, but also in kinship and social networks. Now, I will talk a little bit about the archaeological remains of Irish plantations. So the Office of the City Conservators, CCO, of Santiago de Cuba, has had a particular interest in studying the legacy of what they call French immigration to Santiago and the shift to a coffee culture that radically transformed socially and environmentally the whole province. As an institution, the CCO is investing in preserving, restoring, and rescuing sites like La Gran Sofia, because they are symbolic spaces associated with the fusion of cultural elements that led to the construction of a Cuban nation and a Cuban identity. This is how they present their projects. But similarly to other areas of the country, in reality, the academic research that they undertake then goes hand in hand with the promotion of tourism, an industry which the current Cuban economy is highly dependent on. As such, coffee plantations then have been linked. Coffee plantations that have been linked to Irish immigrants have been included in tourist routes like the Ruta del Café, routes of coffee, and they plan to make them accessible for tourist visitations. Now, to make these sites attractive, the CCO has conceived their restoration of the best preserved plantations, and that they have subdivided the area into two circuits, north and south. But interestingly, 3 out of the 5 French coffee plantations that they included in the South Circuit have a direct Irish connection in their histories. And several others that are in this area actually belong also to Irish immigrants. And they are in very close proximity to this pre-designed tourist route. So why are these archaeological remains of coffee plantations attractive and useful to promote tourism? What can we learn from visiting the sites, and how easy is it to actually access them? And are there no concerns with the impact of mass tourism on the sites themselves? Taking Circuito Sur as an example, I visited La Gran Sofia, I visited La Isabelica coffee plantation in 2020. This is how it looks like. Isabelica is what they consider a model plantation that is preserved as a museum since the 1960s. Even this popular site was very challenging to get to in 2020. That you have to go in the mountain road that leads to La Gran Piedra, which is a landmark in the area, it's a tourist attraction. But then this road abruptly ends, and from then that famous landmark, then to La Isabelica, there's approximately 2 kilometers of rough terrain. This is what it looks like. Back in 2020, I wanted to go all the way to La Gran Sofia, Wright's plantation, which is located 8 kilometers east of La Gran Piedra, near Pico Mogote, 6 kilometers approximately from La Isabelica. But once I was in the area, the locals advised me against the hike, which led me to the conclusion that plantations like La Gran Sofia are difficult to access and to visit. Then I interviewed Dr. Jaumara Lopez Segrera, who is the director of the Center for Study of Coffee Culture. And Dr. Lopez Segrera reported to me that La Gran Sofia was by far one of the most formidable plantations in the area, but that even with their resources and logistics, they had trouble getting to the site. When I asked her why was this particular plantation so fascinating to her, she stated, and I quote, "We were in awe of how big slave barracks were," end of quote. Because unlike sugar, coffee did not necessitate a numerous labor force. Dr. Lopez Segrera estimated that around 100 enslaved people were held at La Gran Sofia. However, we do have like James Wright's letters from La Gran Sofia, and in those letters, James Wright reported as much as 300, a number that is comparable to the wealthier sugar plantations in the West. Certainly, James Wright became one of the biggest landowners in the area, but I am convinced that it was land ownership more than anything else what cemented his status and that of his cohort of Irish immigrants. From 1812 to 1827, alongside his partners Antonio Vinent and Henry Shelton, Wright managed to own 8 different coffee plantations in close proximity to where La Gran Sofia is located. These were named La Gran Sofia, Santiago, which also appears with the names of St. James or St. Jamie, Kentucky or Little Kentucky, La Carolina, Andalucía, El Potrero, and Santa Rita. Of these, I have only managed to find the geographical coordinates for 5. After Wright, the Kindelan Garvey family, which had a wild geese origin, owned a total of 7 different states, 6 dedicated to coffee and 1 to sugar, of which I have only been able to locate 5 in the maps. These are Trinidad del Olimpo, Santa Ana, Santa Bárbara del Guayabal, Humanidad, and Concepción de la Idalia. These have a combined value of 300,000 pesos, which was a considerable fortune at the time. Another Irish immigrant from Lurgan in County Armagh, Richard Maxwell Bell, was listed as the owner of 6 plantations, 2 of them specialized in coffee, of which I have found, of his 6 plantations, I have only found the location of 4. These are El Recuerdo, Soledad, Santa Elena de la de Majagua, La Perseverancia, Santa Ana, and La Candelaria de Guayama. Under Bell's son's tenure, La Perseverancia, a sugar plantation located in Tía Arriba, was reportedly valued at almost 300,000 pesos. And although it was destroyed during the War of 1868, La Perseverancia, the land where La Perseverancia is located today, is owned by the Cuban state and is in very bad shape, according to their own reports. However, they do price this land due to its, and I quote, its potential archaeological value. Bell's Santa Elena coffee plantation also had a significant enslaved population amounting to 250 people. Now, I found a very interesting letter sent in October 31st, 1842, and it was from Charles Clark, who was at the time British consul in Santiago, writing to the mayor of Lifford in County Donegal. And he wrote the following, and I quote, "Sir, and Mr. Samuel Wanton some years back formed a partnership with a Don Juan Morales in the purchase of a coffee estate called Santa Rosa, situated in the district of Santiago de Cuba. Wanton has died, as has also Morales, and I am informed that the heir of the former is a Mrs. Margaret Wanton, who resides in the town of Ballintra in County Donegal, Ireland. I have thus far not retrieved any information about this Wanton family from County Donegal. However, in Cuban sources indicate that they retained the property of the Santa Rosa estate until at least the beginning of the 20th century. In conclusion, a considerable proportion of the coffee material heritage is today in an archaeological state where the structures are partially or completely buried. To local historians, these sites of memory evoke a fascinating history of migration, but not necessarily an Irish one. So their curation for the general public as French has obscured Irish migrants' participation in a historical process of expansion of a plantation economy that, sustained by the enslavement of thousands of West Africans, saw the cultural and economic renaissance of an entire region from the late 1790s until the early 1840s. The 28 Irish coffee plantations I have identified in the East, 17 of which I have actually been able to locate, stand as material evidence of the interconnected history of our two island nations, Ireland and Cuba, standing on opposite sides of the Atlantic world and the Atlantic economy. So success of Cuba exports at the time were credited to a generically homogeneous North American group of merchants, and this umbrella term is frequently found in Cuban historiography, but it does not differentiate Irish people from Scottish, from Irish Americans, from Anglo-Americans, and others. Thus, the experiences of the Irish in Cuba have been, at best, a curious footnote in the work of very prominent historians. But my work, and that of other scholars like Dr. Migratory addresses this historiographical gap and tries to contextualize the nuanced history that situates a pre-famine Irish diaspora on both sides of processes of settler colonialism and empire building. The Cuban coffee industry started to decline in the late 1840s due to the rise of Brazilian and Javan coffees, which were cheaper to produce than Cuba's. As for the Irish coffee states, many suffered significantly during the earthquake of 1852 and were further damaged during the anti-colonial wars for Cuban independence from 1868 to 1878 and from 1895 to 1898. The industry never recovered to its pre-war levels, but the remains of this coffee plantation are still there in the mountains, waiting to be studied. Thank you very much.